Okay, I just want to begin by saying that it's a vast subject because it's all tied in with the nuclear industry and its failure to make any progress in the last 25 years. I chose this title, Small Modular Nuclear Reactors, SMR, Spending Money Recklessly. SMR is really a sales pitch. It doesn't even have a clear definition. Nobody could really give you a coherent definition of what an SMR is. It's really a logo. It's something like Donald Trump's MAGA, Make America Great Again. Nobody knows exactly what it means. So I think spending money recklessly is about as accurate as we can get. Now, at the COP28 just yesterday, well, we had two commitments. One commitment was to triple renewable energy by 2030 and to double energy efficiency, both of which are really the keys to reducing greenhouse gases as quickly as possible. The second suggestion was to triple nuclear power by 2050. This is the slowest, most expensive, and most uncertain way of trying to address the problem. And interestingly enough, there were 117 countries that went for number one versus only 22 countries, less than 1/5, who went for number two. Those 22 countries were mostly the vendors, people who are selling this technology. So it's really all about selling the technology rather than solving the problem. By way of introduction, I'd like to tell you what the status of the nuclear industry is and has been for the last 25 years. Basically, the problem is that the nuclear industry has been stagnant worldwide for the last quarter of a century. This little graph from the World Nuclear Association of a couple of years ago shows the number of operable reactors worldwide. And in 1996, there were 438 reactors. In 2019, there were 442 reactors, a net increase of 4 reactors in 25 years. And the reason for that, of course, is that reactors were being shut down as well as new reactors being built and coming online, and the net change was virtually nothing. Back in 1996, this represented 17% of our global electricity use, whereas nowadays it's less than 10% of global electricity. Nuclear power, in terms of contributing to the world's energy, has been in a steep decline for the last 25 years, and nobody really has anticipated that it's going to reverse direction anytime soon. When we say 17% of global electricity, bear in mind that electricity is only about 20% of global energy. Not all energy is electricity. In fact, half of the energy worldwide is in the form of heat. So that 17% of global electricity is less than 3.3% and has now dropped down to less than 2% of global energy use. Here, they don't actually show that graph, a comparable graph today. What they do instead is show the gigawatt hours, the terawatt hours rather, of electricity produced. And you still see the same stagnation. That little dip around the year 2012 was because 54 nuclear reactors were shut down in Japan as a result of the 2011 triple meltdown. And some of those reactors have been started up again, and so we're seeing a bit of an upslide from 2012. But we're only recovering to the point where, take a look at the bottom there, 2002, there was more electricity contributed by nuclear in 2002 than there are 20 years later in 2022. Just about the same, but a little less. The nuclear industry has realized for many years that they're in trouble, that their whole business, their whole enterprise is in deep trouble. And so they launched what they called a nuclear renaissance back around 2001. And it has been a litany of failures. What they had announced at the time was that there was going to be a tremendous resurgence of nuclear reactors, big ones worldwide, and you were going to see them being built, hundreds of them all over the world, maybe even thousands. Well, it turns out that there were only 4 nuclear reactors ordered, and they tended to be very disappointing. First of all, there was the Olkiluoto reactor in Finland, 1,400 megawatts, a big one. Began in 2005. It was supposed to be operational 3 years at a cost of 3 billion euros. It only started up in March of 2022, 14 years later, at a cost of 11 billion euros. That's 12 billion US dollars. So it's almost 4 times as long to build as promised, and the cost is over 3 times more than it was originally estimated. This is one of the stars of the nuclear renaissance, and it actually bankrupted the French giant Areva, which was absorbed by Électricité de France. The actual losses of Areva on that single project was more than the entire value of the company. Similarly, we had a bankruptcy of Westinghouse as a result of, in 2017, they filed for bankruptcy as a result of that $9 billion in losses from the South Carolina reactors. South Carolina abandoned the project. Georgia did not. The U.S. federal government had given $8.3 billion in loan guarantees on the financing of the 4 reactors. And again, we had a similar story, very slow, very costly, way more than expected. And so we see the cost of nuclear continuing to go up per megawatt hour produced. Around the same time, we had a uranium bubble. This uranium price bubble was purely speculative, and it also happened around 2008, 2009, and it was the result of speculation based on this promise of a nuclear renaissance, which then collapsed shortly afterwards. The price went back down again to historic lows because the nuclear renaissance was a complete fizzle. It just didn't work. But here's the state of affairs just 4 years ago. The state of affairs, according to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, a very pro-nuclear organization, I might add, it said the International Atomic Energy Agency, looking ahead to 2050, sees the most optimistic global electricity market share for nuclear as only about 5%, down from the 10% we have today. So nuclear is continuing to go down, and all the people who are most knowledgeable about the technology are saying that it's going to continue to go down no matter what. The reason is that they're going to be shutting down older reactors much faster than they can possibly build new ones. And in the United States and Europe, it goes on to say, nuclear is going to steadily decline to between 3 and 5% of the market, constituting a potential for market failure, meaning that the business will simply go out of business. So this is what the nuclear industry is fighting against. They want to grab all the money they can to shore up their sinking fortunes. And they know that trillions of dollars are going to be on the table for fighting climate change. They say, we got to grab as much of that money as we possibly can. And they're well positioned to do so because they have infiltrated government in such a way that they are at the right hand of decision makers, and they can whisper in their ear that there's no future without nuclear. And unfortunately, our leaders are gullible enough to believe this without listening to alternative points of view from other people who don't have as ready access to the corridors of power. Now, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, for example, again, just a few years ago, back in 2019, 4 years ago, produced this graph. Nuclear is at the very bottom there, and it's hardly going anywhere, whereas the green line is renewables, and it's soaring up at a tremendous rate. And in fact, the International Energy Agency has said recently that in the next 5 years, 90% worldwide of all new electricity installations will be renewable. They'll be solar and wind. They will not be nuclear or other things. Of course, nuclear is too slow to make a difference in 5 years, but it's going to be too slow to make a difference in 10 or 20 years either. And of course, the other lines represent the various fossil fuels, petroleum and other liquids, natural gas and coal. If we take a look at Wall Street, take a look at the investment advice that's being given by Wall Street investors. This is from April 2023, and it shows from Lazard, who is the most reliable forecaster of costs for energy production facilities. The first red circle I have there, red oval, is solar energy with storage at a utility scale. The second red circle is wind with storage, and the third red circle is nuclear. And you'll notice that the highest possible value cost for solar with storage or wind with storage is considerably less than the lowest cost for nuclear. So we're talking about renewables being 3 to 4 times cheaper than nuclear, both wind and solar. 3 to 4 times cheaper. And what's more, it's about 3 to 4 times faster to deploy. You can put these things up in a season or two. It doesn't take 10 years to get solar and wind online. So what happens is that if you are dealing with an emergency, as we are, then you should go with what's fastest and cheapest before what is most expensive and slowest. And yet, the nuclear industry and their allies are doing everything they can to reverse and turn upside down the natural priorities that should prevail. If you take a look at the cost, the right-hand column is the annual average annual cost reduction. It turns out that solar PV has been going down by about 18% per year in cost. It's incredible, and every single year it has been less expensive the year after than it is the year before. So it's been going down steadily ever since it was a contender. The same thing goes with wind, and the same thing also goes with storage, with batteries. Look at the annual deployment growth in batteries at the very top there, 69% per annum between 2010 and 2020. So in that decade, the growth of battery storage that was reliable for electrical vehicles went up at 69% per annum. So it's important to bear these facts in mind so that when you're talking to people, you can sort of disabuse them of the false notion that nuclear is getting cheaper. It's not, it's getting more expensive. That these small nuclear reactors are going to be more expensive than the large ones. And the reason why is because the large ones were built in order to capitalize on what's called economies of scale. You're not going to have those economies of scale with small ones. It's going to be more expensive per unit of energy produced. By the way, in terms of potential, the potential is also enormous. The current electrical capacity installed in Michigan is a bit more than 30,500 megawatts, whereas the potential for offshore wind just in Lake Michigan alone is over 320,000 megawatts. Now, not all of that can be realized because of various concerns. As a matter of fact, the biggest obstacle to proceeding with some of these plans is social and political, not economic or technical. The economics, and the technical, they're all in place. What's really needed is to solve the social and political problems associated with proceeding. But that potential of 320,000 megawatts, that's more than 10 times the current capacity in Michigan, and it's about 1/4 of the total U.S. electrical capacity today. So we're talking about enormous potential, which is being sacrificed on the altar of nuclear power. Of course, there are challenges with that. I don't mean to say that there aren't challenges. There are challenges with every proposed massive energy expansion, whatever it might be. But nevertheless, let's be honest about what those challenges are and where we're going with it. So SMR is really a second try at a nuclear renaissance because the first one failed. It's kind of opportunism. They say, hey, the money is there, let's grab it. It's maybe our last chance to actually save the nuclear industry. We're talking here not about saving the planet, but saving the industry. So small nuclear reactors are a slogan, and SMR could also stand for second make-believe renaissance. SMR. Now, what they did, first of all, is they crossed out the nuclear from small modular nuclear reactors and just called them small modular reactors because they didn't want to remind people that they are nuclear. And the reason why is because nuclear is where all the problems lie. It's not the small part or the modular part or even the reactor part. It's the nuclear part. So that's what they conveniently leave out. So small modular nuclear reactors, as I said earlier, I call them SMNRs because I put the nuclear back into it. It's not clean, it's not small, it's not green, it's not affordable. And in fact, it's as empty as the MAGA promises that Donald Trump makes. And it's based upon the same strategy, which is lie, 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 and keep repeating those lies over and over so that the decision makers are befuddled, and hopefully the public will also be befuddled. Do not mention those things that make nuclear power undesirable: radioactive waste, reactor meltdowns, nuclear weapons. These are all problems with small reactors as well as with large reactors. Here we have, for example, in Ontario, the Indian chiefs of Ontario passed a wonderful resolution, very clear, expressing their firm opposition to these small modular reactors. This is the Canadian small modular reactor roadmap, because our government has been particularly vulnerable to drinking the Kool-Aid, and they are completely gung-ho on building small modular reactors all over Canada. And basically, one of the things they want to do is use the small modular reactors to help get out the bitumen in the tar sands in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the dirtiest burning fossil fuel there is. So they want to use small modular reactors to help get the dirtiest fossil fuel out of the ground. There's a good way to reduce climate change, eh?
Yeah.
So the elephant in the room here with nuclear power is nuclear waste. It's the root of all the problems associated with nuclear power, and that includes the economic problems. All fission reactors create radioactive waste. Now, a lot of people are confused by the word waste. They think waste is what's left over. No, not in the case of nuclear. That was never there in the first place. There was no waste to begin with. It was only these things were created inside the reactor. So we all know that it all starts with uranium. It's a very special element. It's the key element behind all nuclear fission technology. It's a sobering thought that without uranium, there would be no nuclear reactors of any description, nor would there be any nuclear weapons of any description. Without uranium, none of them would exist. Now you could say, well, can't you use plutonium? Yeah, but plutonium is a uranium derivative. Plutonium does not exist in nature. It only exists as a uranium derivative, and it's only created inside a nuclear reactor. So what is nuclear fission? It's important to be a little bit technical here, just so that we understand what we're talking about. We all know generally that when a neutron hits a fissile uranium atom, U-235, it starts a chain reaction because that atom splits into two pieces or chunks called fission products, which are highly unstable, and also gives off more energy. And that's where the energy comes from. Releasing that nuclear energy, it comes from the nucleus of the atom. But it also gives off more neutrons. And these more neutrons trigger more fissions and go on to create radioactive materials by activation. So really, there's three categories of radioactive waste materials which are created inside every nuclear reactor. First, there are the fission products, which are the broken bits of uranium or plutonium atoms that have been split. They're the broken pieces. They're smaller than the uranium atom. They're generally between 1/3 and 2/3 the size of a uranium atom. Then there's the transuranics, the so-called transuranic actinides, plutonium, americium, and so on. These are heavier than uranium elements, and what happens there is that some uranium atoms don't split. They absorb neutrons and become heavier, and that's where these new elements come from. Plutonium is created in the nuclear reactor. You won't find it in nature. And thirdly, and this is something that many people do not understand, is that there are activation products. There are stray neutrons that escape from the core of the reactor and that impinge upon ordinary non-radioactive materials like the building materials, the water, the air outside the reactor core, but close to it. And those things become radioactive by being activated by absorbing stray neutrons. So materials which are non-radioactive can become radioactive by colliding with a neutron. So radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. That's why we have a nuclear waste problem. We don't know how to shut this off. We have no way scientifically to neutralize it or render it harmless. And so it remains dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. So what is radioactivity? Well, what it means is that the atoms themselves are unstable. They're like little time bombs that explode. And when they explode, they give off a kind of a subatomic shrapnel called gamma radiation, or particles called alpha and beta particles. And these are very damaging to living cells of any kind. And consequently, they can trigger, through ordinary cell division, they can trigger things like cancers and leukemias and many other types of harm, including genetic harm that will be passed on to children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren through the gene pool. These things are invisible. They're normally invisible. If you put a lump of uranium, for example, inside a cloud chamber, then the condensation shows you the paths of those radioactive emissions. And the amazing thing is that that rock is giving off that energy all the time because of the radioactivity of uranium. It's giving that off 365 days a year, seven days a week, 24 hours a day, for millions and millions and millions of years. And it will continue to do so, and we don't know how to stop it. So that's what radioactivity is. And you got to keep it out of the environment because it's going to do a lot of harm to living things. Once it mixes in with non-radioactive materials, it's very difficult to separate it out again. So we have three things: a gamma ray, which is like an X-ray, but more powerful, highly penetrating. But these particles, the beta particle is like a subatomic bullet, the alpha particle is like a subatomic cannonball, and they are harmless outside the body because they don't have enough penetrating power to get inside the body from outside. However, if you get radioactive materials into your body through food and drink or breathing, so if you don't breathe and you don't eat and you don't drink, you're safe. But if you're breathing, eating, and drinking, then you're likely to absorb some of this material into your body, and it causes harm internally. They're internal emitters, and you carry them around with you in your body as long as they stay in your body until they're excreted. Now, a CANDU fuel bundle like one of these can be handled safely before it's used, but after use in a reactor, it will deliver a lethal radiation dose, a deadly radiation dose, in just a few seconds. This man would be dead as a doornail if that fuel pellet that he was holding was actually one that came out of the reactor instead of one that was going into the reactor. And that's another thing that people have trouble understanding. How come the spent fuel is millions of times more radioactive than the fresh fuel? It's because these new radioactive materials by the hundreds have been created. Now, here's a list of some of the radionuclides in irradiated fuel, and they include all three categories: the fission products, the activation products, and the actinides. And it just goes on page after page. There's 211 of these materials, and that's by no means a complete list, and that's only for 10-year-old fuel. This is fuel that's already cooled off for 10 years. These 211 materials are still there. Initially, it has over 1,000 radioactive materials that are newly created, materials that were never found in nature before 1939. I was born in 1940, so these materials are only about as old as I am. And, we have to be very careful about creating deadly poisons. Does it make sense to have technologies that routinely mass produce deadly poisons that are indestructible? That's what we're doing with nuclear power. Now, in the small modular reactors, some of them are going to be using more highly enriched uranium than what we've had in the past. The only type of uranium that undergoes a chain reaction is called U-235, and that's what the red dots represent. The gray dots represent another type of uranium, uranium-238, which does not allow for a chain reaction to take place. So when you enrich uranium, you're increasing the U-235 and making it more explosive. And so when you get all the way over to the right-hand side, you have weapons-grade uranium, more than 90% U-235, which makes a powerful atomic bomb. But on the left-hand side, when you have natural uranium or low-enriched uranium, this stuff cannot be used for bombs. It simply is not. There isn't enough concentration of U-235 to make it explosive. So that is a good thing because it means that ordinary reactor fuel cannot be stolen and used directly to make atomic bombs. That would be completely different if we start using plutonium as a fuel, because plutonium, all types of plutonium can be used for nuclear weapons. It doesn't matter what the concentration is. So that's a difference between uranium and plutonium, and why people are very concerned about moving towards what's called a plutonium economy. Now, in the waste products, the fission products are the chunks, the large chunks that are left over when atoms split. The transuranic actinides are the materials that are heavier than uranium, and they're all radioactive, and they're very, very toxic. They're even much more toxic than the fission products for the most part. And they're also very long-lived. They usually have half-lives that are in the order of tens of thousands of years or even millions of years. They're harmless outside the body because they give off alpha radiation, most of them, but they're extraordinarily damaging when they're inhaled, absorbed, or ingested. When I say absorbed, I mean if you had a cut on your finger and your body was exposed externally to plutonium, if it gets into that cut, atomic workers in the nuclear weapons industry have said that if they got a cut that was exposed to plutonium, they would consider having their hand or their arm amputated in order to prevent it from getting into their body because it's extremely toxic. You can't get it out once it's in there. Now, the creation of plutonium inside a nuclear reactor takes place by uranium-238. When it's hit with a neutron, it undergoes a change and turns into plutonium-239. And that plutonium-239 turns out to be a very powerful nuclear explosive. It's a man-made nuclear explosive, and it's the material which is at the heart of the whole nuclear weapons industry. The nuclear weapons around the world are extraordinarily reliant on plutonium. All of it is created in nuclear reactors. When you look at the toxicity of the radioactive waste from nuclear reactors, the scale on the bottom is a time scale. It goes up to 10 million years. And it shows that the toxicity goes down for around the first 50,000 years, and then it goes back up again a little bit. That's because of internal changes that are going on in the fuel. These things are disintegrating and changing into other radioactive materials. Some of those daughter products, or progeny as they're called, are actually more toxic than the things they started with. For example, plutonium has a 24,000-year half-life, but when it disintegrates, it turns into another radioactive material, which has a 700 million-year half-life. So it's not just a simple story. Now, the longevity of these wastes, and particularly, I want to emphasize that it doesn't matter the size of the reactor, whether it's small or large, they all produce exactly the same type of waste. They may be small differences in the quantities, but not much. And even the fission products, some of them are extremely long-lived. Here we have fission products which have half-lives of over several 100,000 years or even millions of years. Iodine-129 has a 15 million year half-life, for example. And these turn out to be extremely indestructible and they're the ones that will escape most readily from an underground repository. So what's an activation product? Well, strained neutrons, when they hit non-radioactive materials, can make them radioactive. For example, in our Canadian reactors, we use heavy water, which is using a type of hydrogen which is heavier than normal, called deuterium. And when that hits, it's non-radioactive heavy water. But when it's hit with a neutron, it turns into radioactive tritium. And the tritium is an activation product. It's not primarily created in the fuel. It's created outside the fuel. And that's why most of the radioactivity given off by nuclear reactors is in the form of radioactive water molecules, where tritium plays the role of hydrogen. And because it's water, you can't separate it by any there's no municipal water treatment system that can remove tritium from drinking water. The water is activated and produces radioactive tritium. Air is activated and produces radioactive carbon-14. And you know what? All of the organic molecules in our body have carbon and tritium in them. So these radioactive varieties become incorporated right into our DNA, and they can do extraordinary damage even though they're low energy emitters. Even the structural materials in the core area of the reactor become radioactive waste, dangerous for thousands of years. Steel, concrete, zirconium, and other materials become radioactive and cannot be recycled, that they have to be stored as radioactive waste. So you can't even reuse the stainless steel in a nuclear reactor. It's got to be buried as radioactive waste. Somebody has said it's the ultimate in the throwaway society, because, you know, from solar batteries and solar collectors and from wind machines, you can recycle all that material, but you can't recycle the stuff from nuclear reactors. So it's very anti-ecological in that sense. Here's a list of just some of the activation products that occur outside the fuel. So even when the fuel is removed from the reactor itself is still very radioactive. In fact, if you take a look at 34 radionuclides, we see that that they have very, very long half-lives, and they're measured not just in hundreds of thousands of years, but in millions of years. When you dismantle old nuclear reactors, the radiation fields are incredibly high, and therefore it's extremely dangerous for the workers as well as for the people who receive the waste. For example, even after the fuel is removed, the thermal shield will give death in 5.5 seconds to any worker who's too close to it. The calandria shell, which is our reactor vessel, would give you death in 29 seconds. The dump tank, where we dump the moderator in the case of an accident, give you death in 2 minutes. The pressure tubes, which are the individual tubes that contain the fuel, they would give you death in 28 minutes, not because of the spent fuel, but just because the material itself has become radioactive. So SMRs are not clean. They produce radioactive waste of all kinds. The fission products will be more concentrated if the uranium is more concentrated. So as you move towards higher enrichments, the radioactive spent fuel will be more radioactive per kilogram than at lower levels. There has recently been a study published by the National Academy of Sciences pointing out that these small reactors, because they're small, neutrons leak out more easily, and therefore you get a lot more activation happening. And they say that you could get up to 30 times more activation radioactivity in the small reactors compared with the large reactors. So per unit of energy, you can get from 3 to 30 times more radioactivity outside the core of the reactor in the construction materials. That even though the spent fuel is far more radioactive than the building materials, however, the building materials are like rubble and they get more easily into the environment. So they can pose a greater health problem because of their rubbleized nature than the spent fuel, which is more carefully stored and managed, hopefully. Now, let's move on to all fission reactors can cause a radioactive catastrophe. And I want to mention that because many of the meltdowns that have occurred in history have been small reactors, way, way smaller than any reactors they're considering for these SMRs. You may know very well about Fermi 1, the first reactor that was built at the Fermi plant. It was only 69 megawatts of electricity. This is a small reactor. Does that look small to you? Well, the thing is that these small reactors aren't so very small. And it underwent a partial meltdown in 1966, as told in the book, We Almost Lost Detroit. It was a sodium-cooled reactor. Instead of using water, they were using liquid sodium metal as a coolant, which happens to have the property that on contact with water, it undergoes intense combustion and generates a lot of extra heat. So sodium is a nasty material to work with in the first place, and this thing underwent a partial meltdown. The first partial meltdown in the world, by the way, was in Canada at Chalk River with the NRX reactor. It was only 40 megawatts of heat, no electricity at all. 40 megawatts of heat. That would only be enough to create about 10 megawatts of electricity. And it underwent a partial meltdown in 1952. And Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter at that time was in the nuclear navy, and he was one of the people who was sent up to Chalk River to help clean up the mess after that accident. So Jimmy had some firsthand experience with nuclear disasters, even before 3 Mile Island. This is a particular type of fuel that they're talking about called triso fuel. They take little tiny kernels of uranium and they wrap it 3 times around, believe it or not, with different levels of wrapping. And the idea of this is so that they can contain the fission products. Some of them are gases, and they want to contain all those fission products, including the gases, inside those triso fuel elements so that they can save money by not having to have an elaborate containment for the reactor itself. So if you can have the fuel containing its own fission products, that will save you money. Well, I'm not sure if that's a very good idea. This stuff has a lot of carbon in it, and carbon burns, and these things could easily catch fire under the right circumstances. Of course, heat is a big problem. So complications for a deep geological repository, if you wanted to bury this waste, enriched fuel can cause what's called a criticality action. That means an unanticipated, unwanted nuclear chain reaction can get started all by itself in the underground repository. The more enriched the fuel is, the more likely that is to happen. And as they move towards higher and higher enrichments, you have a more likelihood of an underground chain reaction occurring, which is enough energy to seriously compromise the storage facility. Also, it can contain corrosive materials like salt or dangerous materials like sodium metal that reacts violently on contact with water or at high temperatures with air as well. This is from an article called Burning Waste or Playing with Fire. And one of the authors of that was Alison McFarlane, who used to be the director of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission for a period of time. She's now in Canada at the University of British Columbia. Also, all fission reactors do create nuclear explosive materials. As I said before, highly enriched uranium, once you get up to 20% enriched, you're 85% of the way on towards nuclear weapons material. What I mean by that is 20% is already weapons usable, but if you want to get up to the highest grade of weapons grade material, which is the stuff they used in the Hiroshima bomb, you've already done 85% of the work when you get to 20%. And some of these reactors now being proposed are using 20% uranium, enriched uranium. It's kind of crazy. It's really treading a dangerous thing because these things, they want to sell them around the world. So many countries would have access to much more highly enriched uranium. But by the way, the Iranians, under their deal with the United States and with the other countries, with the IAEA, was not allowed to enrich uranium past 5%. And yet here we are talking about building computers and selling them. Reactors and selling them that would use 4 times more enrichment than what Iran is allowed to do under the deal that they had. Here is a reactor, a small reactor. How small does that look? That's only 40 megawatts of heat. That's a clone of the Canadian NRX reactor that melted down. And we gave it to the India as a gift, and the Indians used it to produce the plutonium for their first atomic bomb in 1974. So you don't need a big reactor. Small reactors are dandy for producing plutonium for bombs. And in fact, this is how much plutonium you need to blow away a city. This is the exact size of the plutonium ball that was used as a nuclear explosive in the Nagasaki bomb. That small reactor I just showed you would produce about as much plutonium every year for 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. And you can just stockpile them and use them or not use them as you wish. Now, there's something called reprocessing. And what that is that's a technology for getting the plutonium out of the spent fuel. And unfortunately, with the push towards more nuclear reactors, more and more nuclear salesmen are pushing the idea of commercializing reprocessing, which is already used for weapons purposes. Now, what is reprocessing? It's a technology for taking away the firewall that separates the reactor from the bomb. That firewall is intense radioactivity. As I told you before, if you tried to take a spent fuel bundle, it would kill you in a short time just because of the blast of gamma radiation from it. But most of that radiation is from the fission products. What happens with a reprocessing plant is it removes that firewall by removing the fission products, and then you have access to the plutonium. And you can either use that plutonium as fuel for more reactors, which would go out the front door of the reprocessing plant, or you can send the plutonium out the back door and use it to build nuclear weapons. In fact, that's what India did. They used some of the plutonium for peace and some of the plutonium for war. Is that reassuring? I don't think so. So in Canada, we have the 2 reactors proposed in New Brunswick, the ARC-100 and the Moltex SSR. Both of them plan to reuse spent fuel by doing some form of reprocessing. And we're currently engaged in Canada in fighting the government and we want to have them pass a policy banning commercial reprocessing, which, by the way, is what President Carter did in 1977. He banned plutonium reprocessing in the United States because he was afraid it would send a signal to the rest of the world that it's okay to use plutonium. The only country that separates plutonium that does not have nuclear weapons is Japan, and people are trying to get them to stop, and they may stop. So reusing spent fuel means accessing the plutonium. Beware of the words recycling waste. When they say recycling the waste, what they mean is plutonium reprocessing. So avoid those words. And if you hear the word advanced reactors, avoid that too, because that means you generate more plutonium and you can extract that plutonium to reuse it as fuel. So advanced reactors and reprocessing of any kind raises security risk worldwide. And even though they've talked about a certain proliferation resistant reprocessing, it's an oxymoron. There is no proliferation resistant reprocessing. And if anybody wants, I can send them references on that from the highest authorities. The very people who make the nuclear weapons in the United States have made it very clear that there is no proliferation resistant reprocessing. Finally, these small modular reactors are not really small even. For example, even though they show you a picture like this, which makes it look pretty small, this is the ARC 100 reactor design, but that's only the core of the reactor. They don't show you the rest of it. Here is an artist's conception of the BWRX 300. You see that red van in the front? Well, you can see by that red van that this is about 11 stories high above ground. But even that is deceptive, because if you actually look at the rear end, you see that it also goes 12 stories below ground. So it goes 11 stories above ground, 12 stories below ground. That's 23 stories. That's hardly a small reactor. And it's also not modular. There's no way they're going to build this in a factory and ship it to a location. You got to build that on site with thousands of workers. So this is what the BWRX 300 is like. It's a boiling water reactor, which is related to the reactors that melted down in Fukushima. Those were also boiling water reactors. In fact, you have one of the largest boiling water reactors in the world at Perry on Lake Erie. The Perry nuclear plant is a boiling water reactor, the largest one in the United States. So these are evolutions of that boiling water design that melted down in Fukushima, and they're trying to cut corners. They're trying to reduce the containment, to minimize the protection by saving money. They need to save money if they want to sell these things, because they're going to be, even so, they're going to be more expensive than existing nuclear reactors. Even EBR2, now EBR2, that means Experimental Breeder Reactor 2 in Idaho. It produced only 62.5 megawatts of heat and only 20 megawatts of electricity. 20 megawatts, that's small. This is a small reactor. Does that look small to you? Look at the cars. You know, these are not small. So these words, small modular reactors, is, strictly speaking, they're just simply lies designed to fool people into thinking that there's something magic about them. So I think that I'm pretty well finished. I'm just going to point out that that small modular reactors are certainly not green. They're too costly. They're too slow. They delay climate action. The more money you put into reactors, the more you're going to delay climate action, because it's going to steal that money from other investments, which will be much faster and much cheaper. Climate action is needed now, not 10 years from now. A UK House of Lords reported in 2017, one could not expect a prototype even to be operational before 2030. That's for sure. And even then, you're lucky if you manage to get one working, because we've had examples in Canada, small reactors that were designed and built and never operated because they had fundamental design problems. We've seen already the failure of the NuScale. The NuScale project, which has been canceled now. Oh, it's in Idaho too. Okay. So with higher unit cost per unit of electricity, mass production is needed. That's the reason for modular. But there are so many competitors. There's over 100 different models of small modular reactors. The chance that any one model can corner the market and make it profitable to mass produce them is vanishingly small, because with all that competition, it just erodes the market, fragments the market to the point where you can't really do You don't have a monopoly. You can't really do business on a large scale that way. Before operation, more greenhouse gases are emitted and no carbon relief is available, so we're actually making the problem worse. Germany, for example, more than doubled its offshore wind power capacity in just 1 year, 2014. 2,300 megawatts of wind power added in just 1 year. That is absolutely impossible with nuclear. You just can't work that fast. And by the way, these investments in renewables also pay themselves back much quicker. So they pay themselves back in less than 5 years, and that means that money is available to be reinvested. With nuclear, if you pay back the investment money, then you have to put a large part of the savings away for radioactive waste, for dealing with the radioactive waste and the decommissioning problems. So you're not able to take that money and reinvest it in more energy supply. You have to deal with the problems of the nuclear plant. This is not the case with renewables, and that's why renewables are much more nimble and quicker to apply. SMRs are not affordable. The opportunity costs before, during, and after are incredibly high. That's the end. Thank you very much for your attention.